Breaking news, friends, a large-scale attack on the Russian Federation. In Moscow, they can't cope. It's hitting residential buildings, and there is evidence from Muscovites.
In short, that's the situation. Here it is. This, as I understand, is the block. I hope it's not dangerous. Here's the hole.
Moscow and St. Petersburg have plunged into chaos. This is the first terrifying fuel crisis. There is no gasoline at the gas stations in the capital of Russia. The same goes for the Moscow region and the Leningrad region.
The situation with gasoline, in short, isn't changing. There's no 100 octane, no 95, not even 92. Basically, only diesel is left. I only have about 40 kilometers of range left. And that's it. So listen, gasoline? There isn't any. That's the story.
So, you mean there was a catastrophe, 2 planes collided there. How did that even happen? Well, in occupied Crimea, there are new explosions at the Belbek and Kacha airfields. In Avtodorogi, there were 7 strikes on the airport. And the port of Novorossiysk was also under attack. Drones were coming in from the air and from the sea. The largest oil refining complex on the Black Sea was attacked, the terminal of the Caspian Pipeline Consortium. We'll discuss all this with the well-known political technologist Mikhail Shetremanov. Mikhail, welcome.
Hello, Dasha.
Mikhail, where do we start? There's no gasoline in Moscow or St. Petersburg. How do you interpret this news?
Well, yes, now even Trump knows about it, which is important, because in Latvia, there's simply no gasoline. Now, Trump won't go there. He even knows that he won't be able to refuel his limousine there. Of course, it was especially amusing that he wrote about it in his social media post about the lack of gasoline. And there was another amusing story. I found it not even among Russian propagandists, but just Russians chatting with each other in public forums. So what does this mean? We tried to destroy their energy sector for 300 years and couldn't, but they managed to destroy ours. And indeed, look, they managed to do it. Everything is working. Another pleasant bit of news is that no one is trying to interfere with us in this. Remember, under Biden, both Biden himself and the Secretary of Defense would speak out, saying that strikes on Russian oil refineries were not allowed because it would raise oil prices. And now, when Trump supposedly has the goal of lowering oil prices, is this like a way to raise oil prices? But in fact, he's saying, go ahead. With his posts and all his actions, he's showing, yes, yes, of course, of course. In other words, he fully approves of this whole story. And there isn't a single person in the world, except for some Western politicians, who would object to our strikes. Well, actually, there are Hungary and Slovakia, of course, but even they end up getting criticized by Trump afterwards. That's a good thing.
And what do you think? How serious is this for Moscow and St. Petersburg? Because I looked into it, and if you include this information in the sociological data, this is the first time it's happened. Since before it was Siberia, it was very far from Moscow and St. Petersburg. But today, Petersburg, Moscow, the Leningrad and Moscow regions are under attack. Here's what analysts are specifically writing. Let me just list them. Previously, it was the Nizhny Novgorod, Rostov, Ryazan, Saratov, Amur, Magadan, and Sakhalin regions, the Jewish Autonomous Region, Khabarovsk Krai, Yakutia, Chukotka, the occupied Crimea. These regions were experiencing severe gasoline shortages. But now it's already the Moscow and Leningrad regions, Moscow, St. Petersburg, plus the Far East and Siberia. Is that enough? Or do you think that for something to actually happen, for some turbulence to occur, Nabiullina would have to talk to Putin first?
Well, first of all, unfortunately for us, they will most likely somehow prioritize Moscow and St. Petersburg when it comes to gasoline. Even in Soviet times, you could sometimes buy gasoline in Petersburg, even when it was nowhere else to be found. It was still available there, because they would bring it in, knowing that in really big cities, a complete lack of gasoline would truly cause unrest. So even Soviet leaders tried to patch things up, and Russian leaders understand this just as well. But as soon as you leave the big city, there won't be any gasoline, right? Well, if we're counting on some kind of taxi driver revolution, that's unlikely. We need to focus on practical losses. Practically speaking, if we look at videos from Russia, you see trucks lined up along some of the big southern highways, disrupting logistics, disrupting business. That's very good because it's direct damage to the Russian economy. That's the most important thing. As for the people there, by the way, Trump still expects that the people will get agitated, will rebel. Muscovites should find out that they don't have gasoline because of Putin's war. They already know everything. But the fact is, they physically won't have the means to make weapons because, here's a simple example. Today, it seems the budget of the Russian Federation was approved for the next 3 years, not just one. And according to the official budget plan, their military spending has been reduced. For next year, Compared to this year, it's already been reduced. And we're talking about a sum of around $10 billion. So it's definitely not insignificant, because there's nowhere to get it from, because their budget deficit is so big right now that there's simply nowhere to find this money. This is the result of the work of those who are blowing up, among other things, Russian oil refineries.
Today, Mikhail Peskov made a statement saying that the people will endure for Putin's sake. Patiently, the Russian people, for the sake of Vladimir Vladimirovich, will tighten their belts and endure all of this. And then Trump made the following post. He said that Russia is a paper tiger, to which he was told that paper tigers don't exist, Russia is a bear, and paper bears don't exist either. So that's also how Russia was described. So the US will continue to supply these weapons, Ukraine will reclaim all its territories, and possibly go even further. Here's an interesting question. Where will it go next? After all, the Russian economy is practically destroyed. What do you think?
Yes, first of all, regarding the claim that Russians are ready to give up everything for Putin, to truly endure for Putin, what Peskov said, this phrase is fundamentally important. It should be shown to Trump and anyone else, although Trump probably won't understand what it's about. But in principle, spreading it around the world makes sense. Look, the Ukrainian people are not willing to endure anything for Zelensky. The Ukrainian people are willing to endure for the sake of Ukraine's independence, for their language, their culture, their families, but definitely not for some individual who just happens to lead the country. But in Russia, it's like this. They fight for one person, and if Putin dies tomorrow, then it turns out there's no need to endure anymore. So that's it, like, well, Putin is dead now, so why keep enduring? It turns out that all their trust in the government hangs by a thread, a single Putin thread, and Putin doesn't have that many threads left. Accordingly, if you eliminate one person, it turns out the war will end too. That's the logic of the authorities themselves. Well, it's not really logic, but that's the logic within Russian power. So this shows how Europeans should act, how intelligence services should operate. Here you have the needle of Koshchei, it's well known. This is about what Peskov said, that people believe in Putin and endure for Putin's sake. Secondly, regarding the paper tigers, here Peskov really messed up because he's contradicting Putin's own theses. What's the issue here? Why specifically the paper tiger anyway? Because Putin last week or 2 weeks ago was in China, met with Xi, and there he said that Russia is not only a bear but also a tiger. Those are Putin's words. He said, we have tigers, even Ussuri tigers. We're not just a country of bears, we're a country of tigers. So it turns out that Peskov is completely contradicting his own boss's words. As for paper bears, they do exist. For example, there are candies like Bear in the North, Bear with a Paw. You can make origami, and you get a cute little bear if you fold it out of paper. That's exactly the state Russia is in right now. Or take Mishustin, he's also a bear, a little bear cub, kind of like a paper bear cub. Yeah, well, that's just joking around, but what is Trump actually right about? By the way, this is finally important for us too. This is what was conveyed to him. I don't know who exactly did it, but for example, today's Ostrozhny Journal claims that it was Keith Kellogg who managed to get these points across to him, and that it was also Volz, who is now the ambassador to Volon and a former advisor, who managed to convey this. They managed to get a few things across to Trump. The first thing is that Russia looks very bad on the battlefield, that over the past 3 years they basically haven't had any victories, and that all of Putin's stories about how they're conquering something or constantly encircling are just fairy tales. In fact, they laid a map out on the table for Trump and said, look, here's the map. Here's 3.5 years of war. And Trump was like, oh, really? He said, after all, a strong country would have won in a week, so what's the issue then? So that means Russia is some kind of weak country. And then I think they gave him the rest of the statistics about Russia, because in Trump's mind, at the start of his term, Russia was sort of an ally. He didn't say these words directly, but he said that Russia was our partner in the war, our ally. But it wasn't Russia. The Russian Federation didn't exist back then. Or rather, the Russian Federation, in general, he kept portraying the Russian Federation as some kind of superpower, which it isn't, out of old habit. But he grew up in a time when there was the Union. At his university, they studied the Soviet Union when he was a student, as an enemy, as a powerful state, as a country that, after all, had the second largest GDP in the world and the third largest population in the world. And I think he never really considered that now the Russian Federation is only about 10th in the world by population and just 2% of the world's GDP. He simply never thought about it. Like for any person, I think cognitive biases are typical. It's not that Trump is somehow special in this regard. Well, I don't know. For example, when I was planning a trip to Vietnam, I thought there were about 20 million people living there. But I remember that's what I learned back in Soviet school. I checked Wikipedia. It's actually 100 million. You see, that's quite a mistake, isn't it? Or say someone asks about the population, like what's the most populous country in Asia after India and China? And very few people would name Bangladesh or Pakistan because they just don't remember them as the largest countries, even though Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Indonesia have much larger populations than Russia. This is a typical example of cognitive bias. And so it seems that for the first time in his 9 months, or 8 months, however many months, of peacemaking efforts, Trump actually thought about the subject, about who exactly he was trying to reconcile. As it turned out, this requires knowledge, and he acquired that knowledge. And that's where this post comes from, I think.
You know, Mikhail, this is about Trump's speech at the UN General Assembly. He had a lot of complaints there about the organizers, about the United Nations as an organization. The escalator wasn't working, the teleprompter wasn't working. That's also interesting what you discussed, but the public has split into two camps over this. So, for example, the British media wrote, mainly this Chavigraph, an authoritative American columnist who works for a British authority, he wrote that this is a failure from the perspective of big geopolitics, because Trump is stepping away from Russian aggression, saying, you, Europe, deal with it yourselves, we'll sell you weapons, and that's where we'll leave. I couldn't end this war. That's just how it happened. My relationship with Putin is normal, but I can't end the war. So you go sort things out with Europe on your own. But there are others, because there are commentators who believe that no, now Trump will really turn up the heat, impose sanctions, and deliver long-range missiles, and not just that, and soon. How would you assess this?
No, well, I'm more or less somewhere in the middle here. In what sense? First, I don't believe that Trump is going to really turn up the heat on anyone right now. He never promised that to anyone, not in any of his speeches, and not even in that post where he supposedly played some big role. He has made his position very clear. This is Europe's war. Europe should pay, but we will provide any weapons. You buy, and we'll provide any weapons. We'll be involved in all of this until the end, and we're on your side. He made that clear as well. And that also means intelligence, for example, which no one really pays for anyway. So it's not a matter of money, it's a matter of whose side America is on. He made that side clear, but at the same time, to expect that he will start paying for it, that's not the case. He has said many times that Europe should pay for everything because this is a European war and he has enough of his own wars to deal with. That's why I think what we have is enough. In other words, what he did is more than we expected. By the time Trump became president last year in November when he was elected, it was already clear that we wouldn't be getting any new military aid. He repeated this so many times during the campaign, and J.D. Vance repeated it so many times as well that it was obvious that this was it, that this was his clear campaign promise. Just look at how he's acting. The main thing is that we shouldn't give any new money either, because I promised my voters that we wouldn't give money to Ukraine. If you look at the profile of his voters, by the way, you'll see that most Republican voters support Ukraine, but not financial support. That is, the majority are in favor of supporting Ukraine in the war, but not giving money, and he is following his voters. He can't do otherwise. That's why we don't expect any breakthroughs from him. We expect breakthroughs from ourselves, from our own results. Now our hands are untied. We've been given the green light for anything at all. Yes, that's right. At the very beginning, when it was announced, explained, and sent off through Moscow, through Novorossiysk, and now all of this is allowed for us. And by the way, as Zelensky said, if the Russians strike at our energy sector, we have the right to respond with American weapons. And Trump has also given his consent to this. But it should be purchased with European money.
That's also an important point. Yes, these are Flamingo missiles. This is Ukrainian ballistic weaponry. This is serial production. The president constantly emphasizes that we need funding. We can produce both ballistic and cruise missiles in series, but we need help from our European partners. Then President Zelensky said that we either need to end the war or I need more than 120 billion euros or dollars today. Meaning for Ukraine to support its economy and not just its weaponry, not just the armament of Ukraine. And here, Mikhail, along with my analyst, everyone is asking the question, where are our missiles? Okay, there's no need to ask Trump, no need for tomahawks and so on. Let's just start producing a series of cruise and ballistic missiles and completely destroy Russia's military and energy resources, especially since President Zelensky said in his latest interview that the Kremlin will feel it too, that they will also be sitting in a basement like we are. That was a direct quote. What do you say to that?
I'll say that, for example, in the Russian Federation, they produce both cruise missiles and ballistic missiles, and one, well, I've already forgotten all the exact prices, but roughly speaking, a KH-101 cruise missile costs $13 million in the US for one unit, $12 million. An Iskander missile costs $3 million per unit. And that's without the launcher, without anything else, just the missile itself, $3 million. So what kind of choice do we always have? We can make these large airplane-type drones. I don't know how much ours cost because there's no data on them, but we do know that the Iranian ones originally cost around $40,000, while the Russian ones cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, these drones that are used against us. But let's even take the Iranian price, just as an example, okay? $40,000. So we have a choice, right? And our missile, we also don't know how much it costs, but let's assume it's cheaper than the Russian one, since we're making it ourselves. And of course, we'll be smarter about it. Let's suppose we make a missile not for 3, but for 2 million, for example. So the choice is to make 50 drones or one missile, you see, and we have to weigh that. We could make 50 drones, each carrying 100 kilograms of explosives, or one missile that carries a ton, as we know from the examples given, well, according to the data that was reported. And here you have to weigh the military rationale, right? For example, if we make 50, maybe 3 of them will break through and the rest will be shot down, while the missile might be shot down with, say, a 50-50 chance. These are the kinds of considerations involved. That's why the Iranian said that the money for all this isn't unlimited. When he says it's about 20 billion, I think what he meant, at least looking back, that's how I interpret it, he meant that we need assistance in the amount of 120 billion for this. 120 billion is the total expenditure for Ukraine in the coming years overall.
Yes, that is.
Some of the money is there, some of it isn't. Well, roughly speaking, according to all the IMF data and so on, right now we're looking for funding for the next 2 years, 2026 and 2027, as we continue to fight. We need about 60 billion each year just to keep building all of this. We basically don't have that kind of big money. So, yes, some missiles were used. That's a fact because, for example, during the bombing of Luhansk, there were definitely missiles involved. And in Crimea, when helicopters were shot down, remember, those were also Ukrainian missiles in action. But in terms of quantity, I think there are few of them simply because, well, I think there just isn't the funding for it. And if there is money, there will be missiles. Now, the last bit of good news, because with this really, and by the way, this is, so to speak, the pessimistic side of my nature talking, in this sense, it seems that money will be our biggest problem next year. It's not about getting American weapons, which, after all, the Europeans will probably purchase for about 12 billion, as agreed. But where to get the money for this production itself is a very big question, as well as for military salaries. And it seems that the most realistic chance, though a complicated one, is what is being discussed now, that we will receive the so-called reparations credit from the European Union. Yes, this is what the European Commission has now stated, well, unofficially, in their conversations with the media with Vostoviceni. The issue being considered is to give us 130 billion over 2 years, secured by reparations. In other words, Russia owes us reparations and they have Russian deposits there. They are freezing these deposits, but not just freezing them indefinitely. The idea is that we will return them to Russia as soon as it pays the reparations, and we will use those reparations to pay back the European Union. That's the story. But if this doesn't happen, it will be extremely difficult to get the money, and for now, Europe isn't really ready to shell out. Last year, at the beginning of the year, when Trump said he wouldn't fund anything anymore, all of this happened in February, when on February 28th, Zelensky was actually kicked out of the White House. And after that, remember, all of Europe supposedly stood up to defend us, at least in words. And then Kaja Kallas and Ursula von der Leyen immediately developed a new program to finance Ukraine for 50 billion, but no one signed on to it. 50 billion a year, but no one signed. And that money doesn't exist. Unfortunately, no one is giving us anything so far. This is Keobo Fortuna. To build weapons, you need money.
I'm very interested in your opinion. Looking at the situation as a whole, I tend to think that we are facing a very long war between Russia and Ukraine, a very long one, which could last for many more years. It turns out that we will be living in a state of permanent war. How do you feel about the situation? Are you always rational enough, or do you approach things rationally? How do you feel the events will unfold from here? And what do we need to do to force Putin to stop the war? For example, I believe that Putin will not stop fighting until he dies. Whether that will be death from old age or some kind of succession, it's hard for me to say, but as long as he is alive, he will continue waging war against Ukraine. What do you think? What's your opinion?
So first of all, yes, as long as Putin is alive, he will undoubtedly wage a war to destroy Ukraine. I absolutely agree with you. And most likely he will also wage war against other countries, which he similarly wants to destroy. For example, the Baltic states, I have no doubt that his goal is to destroy the Baltic states and their statehood, thereby restoring their occupation as it was during Soviet times. But that's just the minimum. There are surely other plans as well. Moldova, obviously, there are plans for that too. And Putin has no intention of living in any other state of affairs. But what Trump is seeking right now, for example, is not a permanent end to the war, but essentially just a ceasefire. That is, sometimes the war stops, the fighting ceases, and then it resumes again after some years. Do such situations happen? Yes, that happens. This has happened between Israel and the Gaza Strip, between Israel and Lebanon, between Armenia and Azerbaijan. They just froze the conflict. And then from that point, after some years or even decades later, they started fighting again. So even under Putin, a freeze is possible. With Putin, it's impossible to stop this war. And that's it for it to stop. By the way, there was a sociological survey conducted by the KMIS agency. For example, the majority of Ukrainians support the European settlement plan, not Putin's plan, of course, which involves occupation, but the European one, a freeze along the line of contact and security guarantees from Europe. That plan is supported by more than, I think, 70% of people here, something like that. But at the same time, out of those 70%, more than half don't believe it will last long. In other words, they believe that after a while, the war will start again. You believe and you go along. Well, at least for a while, it means we won't have war. Then it will start again. Now, right now, there is an attempt to make Putin stop, at least temporarily. When you ask what we can do, the answer is nothing. I mean, Ukraine can't do anything to make Putin stop the war. There is one country in the world that can do something. That country is China. No one else. It seems everyone understands this. The European Union understands this. Ursula von der Leyen met with the foreign ministry. At the UN General Assembly, China tried to persuade them to exert influence. Trump is calling Xi, trying to find common ground. He plans to meet with him this fall to try to find out under what conditions Xi would agree to put pressure on Putin. That is, Putin's own conditions are a separate matter altogether. The conditions under which Xi would agree to pressure Putin, these conditions, they're not about us. They're not about what we are willing to agree to. At this point, that's not important. What matters is that Xi himself doesn't know where the front line is. None of that matters to him either. He doesn't care whether Russia wins or not. None of that is important. What matters is that Xi can trade this war, Xi and Trump, for some Chinese interests, so to speak. For some reason, everyone thinks it's about Taiwan. But I'm not at all convinced that this is a conversation about Taiwan. These could be huge economic interests in the field of artificial intelligence, supercomputers, and so on, access to certain technologies and knowledge. And so Xi can do this. Why? Because Xi simply has a lever in his hands. As you remember, when Trump was pressuring us to agree to a ceasefire unconditionally, and we refused, he simply stopped supplying us with weapons and intelligence, and after 3 days we agreed. The Chinese could do the same in a single day if they wanted to, if they needed to. They could stop all supplies to Russia, absolutely everything. And after 3 days, Putin would agree to any conditions.
So right now, the key question is how and who can put pressure on China? And in general, is it even possible to pressure China?
It's impossible. I'll say that right away. Let me answer you immediately on that. It's impossible to put pressure on them because Trump already tried to pressure China. At the start of his term, well, more precisely on April 2nd, Trump imposed tariffs against the Chinese, big high ones, over 30%. And he thought that by doing this, he was putting pressure on China. But China pushed back and imposed tariffs as well. He imposed another 50, and they imposed another 50. It reached 146% on both sides. China didn't even flinch for a second, so that pressure didn't work. And the US backed down. It was the US that canceled all those tariffs. They kept applying pressure but couldn't succeed. So applying pressure doesn't work. No, exchange. Well, what does Trump say? You have to exchange something for something. So the US should exchange something with China? Well, I don't know, like the Panama Canal. Remember? The fuss around the Panama Canal at the beginning. At the beginning of Trump's administration, there was talk about taking away the right of passage from Chinese companies and making the Panama Canal ours. And Xi would say, no, we want the Panama Canal. Again, not just for that, we'll go as a package deal. If, so to speak, a big deal happens between Trump and Xi, then stopping the war in Europe would be part of that deal.
Mikhail, there's another very important topic which you actually mentioned. It's Putin's big war with the NATO countries. So what are we seeing right now? This morning, while I was preparing for the interview with you, there was news that in Norway, I think several airports were closed because for 12 hours, 12, Carl, unknown drones were in Norwegian airspace. They were there, but no one shot them down because, as you rightly said, shooting them down would cost more than all those drones put together. Now they were there for more than 12 hours. And 2 days ago, Denmark and Norway were also attacked by unknown drones, but that lasted only a few hours. Before that, MiG fighter jets entered Estonian airspace for up to 20 minutes. Again, nothing happened there either. But everyone keeps telling me, Dasha, Estonia can't do anything. It has nothing. Before that, both missiles and drones had entered Polish territory, and after that, drones almost attacked the residence of Polish President Karol Nawrocki while he was on an international visit. And now the question is, what will Russia do next? Are these all just provocations? Or is Russia simply testing NATO's Article 4 and 5, and then, I don't know, will just invade the Baltic countries, the Suwałki corridor, and that's it? And they'll go off to consult. And Trump will be dining in a restaurant saying, this is some kind of mistake, this is some kind of mistake.
But then Russia really isn't testing Russia. Well, how is Russia testing in order to invade? I'm not sure about the corridor, whether we even need it at all, but just to invade. If they're planning to capture the entire Baltics, then at that point, the corridor is completely unnecessary. The corridor was important, back when, militarily speaking, this very corridor, when Sweden and Finland were not in NATO, because then, by connecting Belarus with the Kaliningrad region, they would cut off the Baltic states from NATO, and that would be it, since the Russian fleet would also be stationed at sea. But now the Swedes and Finns are at sea, and so the Baltic states, fortunately, now they have a rear. There's the Swedish island of Gotland, which protects the Baltic states. There's a huge military base there. All of this protects the Baltic states, so no. The Suwałki corridor, by the way, can, in a sense, be forgotten. But we must not forget that Russia really is preparing to launch a direct military invasion. At this point, I think hardly anyone has any doubts about that. And all of this, yes, this is an operation. Look at how quickly it's accelerating, how rapidly all of this is speeding up. By the way, all the experts, military experts, have noted again that Putin sped up sharply after his meeting with Trump in Alaska. Just yesterday, there was an interview with Zelensky at night on Fox News, and it was Fox News telling Zelensky, notice, not Zelensky telling Fox, but Fox telling Zelensky, about how Putin sped up after his attacks on Ukraine following his conversation with Trump. Fox is absolutely a pro-Trump channel. And they were showing infographics saying, look, it was like this before, and now it's like this. So you think that the Trump-Putin meeting helped Putin that much and so on? I was sitting there. I couldn't believe my eyes that Fox was saying this right in front of Trump. And that's why, among other things, you see strikes on Europe, on European countries. What will happen next? Will everyone really just sit in cafes and wait for this attack? Or will this attack be repelled from the very beginning? This is exactly what is being decided right before our eyes right now. At the moment, there is no consensus among the allies yet. But some have already said right away that we need to shoot them down. The first to say this was the president of the Czech Republic. We will shoot down Russian planes. Then I think the prime minister of Poland also said something about it. No, actually, Poland has only talked about drones so far, sorry. It was Ursula von der Leyen who specifically said about planes that we will shoot them down. Russian planes, that this is an option on the table. Now, when we talk about Estonia and say that Estonia itself can't do it, well, that's not really a question for Estonia. Estonia has an agreement with NATO. I'm not talking about Article 5 or Article 4, but a direct agreement on the protection of Estonia's airspace. There's an agreement with NATO, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia signed it when they joined in 2004, that there is a squadron, back then it was F-16s, now probably F-35s, stationed in Šiauliai, Lithuania, and they are responsible for protecting the airspace of these three countries. In fact, that's why each of the Baltic countries makes an annual payment, specifically for this protection. Right now, Italian planes are on duty there, and if anything happens, it will be them who shoot down the Russians. But they need an order to do so, a political and military order. And I think that order will be given, of course. So I don't believe that this will just go on indefinitely and harmlessly. The Danes, Swedes, Norwegians, you see, they picked the wrong people to mess with. These are the most resolute ones. Northern Europe is now the most determined enemy of the Russian Federation. They will fight because they remember the entire occupation. They're not like the French in some sense. They remember the occupation. They have always seen Russia as an enemy. The Finns remember the Winter War. They will never forget it. They joined NATO. That's why I think there will be a war in the north, some kind of conflict with the Russians.
So, in essence, this is a matter of the near future.
I think so, yes. Of course, I don't know Putin's plans, when what. But this idea was voiced by many at the current UN General Assembly that it's time to realize that Trump won't leave. Putin. It's time to realize about Trump Putin is not going to wait for the war in Ukraine to end before attacking European countries. For some reason, it was believed in Europe that he first had to defeat Ukraine. If he won, then he would attack. Now there is such a thesis, not our own, but one from global intelligence agencies, Western intelligence, that Putin has plans to attack another country right during the war with Ukraine.
Mikhail, yesterday I did a live stream with Dmitry Gordon. It was published on my channel. And Dmitry recalled Rogozin's statement and interview where he said that there is currently a stalemate at the front and Ukraine has a multiple advantage in drones. This was, from Russia's point of view, a controversial interview for him, as well as the dismissal of Kozak, who is also planning to give some big interview to Western or maybe pro-Russian media. I don't know. Is it even worth paying attention to this, in your opinion? And are these elements important?
Well, I think hardly anyone even remembers Rogozin anymore. And Rogozin has always had several, how should I put it? He is definitely not a player in all of this. Rogozin is not a political player. He is someone who tries to secure certain positions in order to have influence, to make money, but he is not an independent political player, like Strelkov was, for example. Strelkov, among other things, was an independent political player. That's why he ended up in prison right away, because that's the kind of person he was. If Rogozin said anything, it was either out of stupidity or perhaps the opposite. Because he wanted to get a contract for building drones, maybe he has some shares in factories or something else. We don't know what he's lobbying for there or what preferences or contracts he's securing for himself. That's why I quite believe that this statement was made in that sense, not in a political one. And as for Kozak, I actually think his figure is incredibly overblown. I don't mean himself as a person. Obviously, he was an important person, deputy head of the administration, but the idea that he was supposedly fired because of some disagreement with the war after 3.5 years. So for 3.5 years, we supposedly tolerated his disagreement with the war and then fired him. That sounds like a story from some kind of fantasy world, in my opinion.
Mikhail, to sum up, everyone is criticizing the 19th package of European Union sanctions. Well, it's not serious enough. When I talk to economists, they all tell me, Dasha, all of this will only take effect in 2028, not before. Don't have any illusions. Dasha, this is not enough. Dasha, this is very little. You said that the only country that can make Putin stop is China. Do you think that European Union sanctions, if, for example, the US joins in, could in some way really, I don't know, worsen the state of the Russian economy, stop Putin regarding these packages? I'm interested in your opinion.
They definitely could, but we still don't know anything about this package yet because the package hasn't been adopted so far. The package has only been announced so far. That's absolutely right. And in this announced package, most importantly, we haven't seen this detail. You yourself say since 1928, but we're not sure that's the case because what Trump demanded, and by the way, the US Secretary of Energy spoke about this as well, that he met with a representative of the European Commission, with Alivan, and that they agreed, for example, that in this new package, Russia will not be able to purchase Russian gas on the spot market starting from January 1st, which is in 3 months. So this means that old contracts are allowed, but new ones can no longer be signed. This is already a very big blow to the Russian, well, to liquefied gas for sure, because this liquefied gas is sold through spot contracts. The thing from the 27th, that's only about pipeline gas, but as for liquefied gas, which Europe buys half of Russia's liquefied gas, half, and buyers, for example, from 8 or 10 countries. So that's a lot. Next, we still don't know whether it will be adopted as is in this wording or another. Maybe from the first, maybe with exceptions for the Italians. Well, for example, when we see it, it will become a fact. And the next thing mentioned in this document is that sanctions will be imposed as part of this package against Chinese refineries and Indian refineries that process Russian oil. That would be very significant if all of this ends up in the package, because sanctions against refineries mean that their products can't be purchased, their accounts can't be serviced, and they won't be able to conduct any transactions in dollars or euros at all. If this happens, it would already be considered pressure on China as well, not just on the Russian Federation. So, in my opinion, it's only worth discussing how serious this package is once it has been approved. Of course, I also have serious doubts that it will be approved in its fullest scope. These words from Ursula can be interpreted as being against all refineries. You can read directly in the document she presented that it seems to be against all Russian refineries.
Look, there's a ban on the import of Russian liquefied natural gas. On the EU market, a complete ban on transactions for Rosneft and Gazprom Neft, the freezing of assets of other companies, sanctions against 118 shadow fleet vessels that help circumvent all established restrictions, additional oversight of traders and oil refining companies in China, and also finances cryptocurrency. For the first time, sanctions against crypto farms, transactions in cryptocurrency, a ban for foreign banks that cooperate with such alternative payment systems, for example, Mayar. That's it. These are the main topics that she has just announced.
That's absolutely right. You see, this phrase about traders in China, we don't really know how far this will go or what exactly will happen.
No, these are just general words for now.
These are just general statements for now. So when we get to specifics, then we'll understand.
Mikhail, let's wrap up our stream for today. Tell me, should we really... Everyone was expecting something from the meeting in Alaska. We all understand that perfectly well. The world kind of paused for a moment. Everyone was waiting, thinking maybe Putin would come out and say, "I'm stopping the fighting, Donnie Trump. Thank you for this." But that didn't happen. Should we expect something from the meeting between Trump and Xi Jinping in the same way? Will it really be historic?
Well, in theory, it could be. Negotiations between these two countries are ongoing. It's not like it is with us and the Russians or with the Americans and the Russians. We don't have constant negotiations with Russia. Even the Russians themselves have now stated that there is no negotiation process going on at the moment. But between the Chinese and the Americans, it is ongoing, overseen by Scott Besson, who basically meets almost daily now, or at least his team does. And I can't know at what stage these agreements are. They won't come out and say, well, we have stopped the war, because they simply can't say that. But based on what they say about the relationship between the US and China, we'll be able to understand whether we're included in their package or not. You see, yes, they can. So how did the meeting in Alaska end? With the fact that they didn't even have tea, the lunch was canceled, the press conference was canceled, and Putin was kicked out of Alaska. Just like Zelensky was once kicked out of the White House, Putin was kicked out of Alaska. It's exactly the same format. And now the meeting in China could end with them not even having tea, not eating, just leaving. And then we'll understand that we have nothing to count on. Or maybe they'll end up sitting together twice as long as planned, like what just happened at the EU meeting with Trump and Zelensky. And then, I don't know, they'll announce a whole bunch of agreements. And then we'll understand, yes, we'll understand that if that's the case, then we're in. And now a new chapter begins for us on the front of peace negotiations, so to speak. So Russia is starting to come under pressure from China, on the contrary. But it won't be like that. That's it. We've signed peace. Ukraine, that's it. Starting tomorrow, no more missiles will be coming your way. Of course, that's not how it will be.
Mikhail Shatelman, well-known political technologist. Mikhail, thank you, and I hope to see you again. All the best.
Thank you, Dasha. Thank you.